All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first edition of the SSChat Book Club. We are so excited to be here today. My name is Jessica Ellison, and I am a teacher educator at the Minnesota Historical Society. And I'm so excited today to be here with Kenneth Davis, who is the author of many books, but the one that we're going to be discussing today is called In the Shadow of Liberty. So, Kenneth, hello.
Hello, Jess. It's great to see you again. The
Good to
last
see you.
time we were together at the Social Studies Conference, it was a wonderful day, but we didn't get enough time to spend with each other. So now we can fill in some of the blanks. I am here in New York City, and just to flesh out the biography for those who don't know, most people know me as the author of Don't Know Much About History, which was published, I hate to even say it, in 1990. But still going strong. And so this is a new book and very different in some respects. Don't Know Much About History, as many people know, is a series of questions and answers about American history, from who really discovered America right through Barack Obama's first administration. And this new book is obviously very different. The accounts of 5 people who were the personal property of 4 of our greatest presidents.
And it was written for a younger audience than you usually work with, correct?
That's correct, and that's where I would probably start this conversation by saying this is in fact the result of about 5 years of being involved with SSChat and with doing Skypes into classrooms over the last 5 years. And I discovered, to my great glee, that I really enjoyed talking to younger people. I enjoyed talking to students. I found them engaged, interested, curious, wanted to know more, wanted to hear stories. And so that experience really set me on the path to write a book specifically aimed at a young adult audience readers. But I should also say that I find and I believe that this is a book that a great many older adults will also profit from, because the story is quite incredible, and it's one of the most important stories in our history, the story of what slavery meant to America and what it still means today.
And I enjoyed it so much. I think you're absolutely right. I think students will be able to get into these stories in a different angle than they might sometimes look at it, but I think it's great for context for teachers as well. So one of the first things I wanted to talk about is the way that you started the book, because you open with the painting of the Washington family, and in the background there is a black man, and he's not identified, and you say, who is he? So why was it that you decided to start this way?
Well, like I said, Don't Know Much About History is a book that started with questions. So this book starts off with a question as well. Who is he? Yes, it's a famous painting that's at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. By Edward Savage. And it shows President Washington and Martha Washington sitting in their home. Their 2 grandchildren, who they had adopted and raised as their own, are there. And they're in the background then. So we know the names of the 4 central figures, but there in the background, in profile, is this man, somewhat in shadow, dressed in livery, the fancy aristocratic clothing of the period, and we don't know who he is. And it seemed to me that this portrait of the most famous man in America that didn't identify someone else in the picture perfectly summed up what this book is essentially about. That for all of the time we have been talking about American history, we've left some very important people out of the story. That's one of the things I've concentrated on in my career in writing about American history. But specifically in this case, I wanted to write about the nameless, faceless people who were enslaved. And in this case, I'm focusing on 5 people who were enslaved by men like Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Jackson. And fortunately, we can give those people a name and a face in some cases. And that's what I wanted to try and do with this book. So the book opens with the question, who is he? But it's obviously meant to be a much broader question. These are the people who were certainly standing in the shadow of liberty, that these people, enslaved in bondage to the great proponents of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, embody the great contradiction in our history. And that's, I think, what this book is really about, but primarily it's about these people, and history has to be a story of real people.
Well, and I think this is a good opportunity to also say that starting out with artwork and including artwork of the time is a really great way to get students interested and engaged, because if you start your unit on colonialism and the revolution with this image, that really gets them thinking immediately, wait, there are other people involved in this story.
Right, because most of us are accustomed to seeing Washington and the paintings of Jefferson, and they're on our money, and they're on the sides of the buildings, and we have statues to them. But these people that I'm writing about were mostly left out of the pictures, or if they were included, they were nameless. So it's and obviously we live in a very visual age. Here we are. Instead of writing and reading this in a magazine, or if we were in an actual book club, obviously we'd be discussing it. But we're in an age where everyone responds much more to images, and so the book is filled with extraordinary, I think, images from the period, both historic paintings that were painted much later, as well as documents from the period, and that I think gives a vibrancy to the story, and I was pleased to be able to do that in a book for younger readers. But I'm sure that, again, many adults will appreciate seeing those things as well. And the fact, and this is perhaps an extraordinary part of the book, the fact that we actually have photographs of some of these people is maybe perhaps one of the biggest surprises, and maybe one of the biggest shocks to me as a researcher, that we have photographs of people who were enslaved by Thomas Jefferson or Andrew Jackson and James Madison. This is not ancient history. We are really incredibly close to this story, and the fact that we have photographs of some of them, I think, proves the point. And that's one of the reasons I did want this to be a very visually interesting book.
And it absolutely is. And I think that the section where you talk about the slave trade, in particular with the descriptions with the images that a lot of us are familiar with, the boats crammed with human bodies, is something that I think is really striking for students. But what I also found interesting is that you include some kind of difficult descriptions of what happened on those ships. And I think it's important for students to hear those things. But why is it that you found that those were important to this narrative?
Well, I think that one of the problems that we've had with teaching American history as it's been taught from the very beginning, and I'm talking about going back 200 years, is that we've always tried to create a sanitized, pretty version, a folktale, bedtime story version of American history that denies the ugliness that is part of our past. Of course, we want to paint a picture of pride and patriotism for children to grow up and be proud of some of our traditions. But when we do that at the expense of leaving out reality, I think we do ourselves and history and the students a disservice. Certainly, as a person who wrote for adults, I didn't have to worry too much about discussing things like the barbarous conditions on the slave ships and the grueling stories of people being thrown to the sharks. As you know from reading the book, those accounts are there. It's a harsh reality, but that's what history is. History has ugly moments. It would kind of be like trying to talk about Anne Frank and not talking about what happened in the camps. It's impossible to do. So I think we underestimate children also, especially young adults. First of all, they're a lot more sophisticated probably than I was when I was 13 or 14. And I think that the culture is, certainly more open, and the truth is that they've probably seen much worse stuff on a video game they might play, or a movie they might see, or a television show than a description in this book. And I think that it's really important to be honest with kids. Otherwise, they're just going to say, when they find out that you haven't been telling them the truth, that they kind of got cheated.
Hmm. Exactly. And I think that that leads into another thing that I've been thinking about and some of our teachers think about is that we have to reconcile these stories, the stories that we learned growing up about our founders and George Washington and the cherry tree that still persists, and all these images of the bigness and greatness of these men, which is true. But then when they're reading your book, all of a sudden there's this whole new layer that these men were the owners of people. And so, you know, what kind of advice could you offer to teachers then about getting students to reconcile these images of the founders with the idea that they also owned human beings?
Well, I think that's the core of what the book is about. I set out a long time ago when I first wrote Don't Know Much About History, and I raised this question of how could these men who sacrificed, and they did sacrifice, and they took enormous risks, and they certainly risked their lives and their fortunes and their liberty, as they put it in the Declaration of Independence, for the cause of independence, for the cause of a free and independent United States. So there's no taking away from the personal risks and the extraordinary accomplishments that men like Washington and Jefferson were able to produce in their lifetimes. But for far too long, the scales were tipped in favor of this perfect, especially when it comes to Washington, image of the unsullied hero, the little boy who could not tell a lie. But then we have to learn, as I reveal in this book, and I won't get too far ahead of where we are, that Washington did lie, in fact, when it came to keeping enslaved people, particularly when he was president in Philadelphia. So I think that history is always about true stories of real people, and that certainly the children and the students and the young adults who are reading this book, I think, have the wherewithal and the maturity to understand that Washington was a real person, a human being, as were all these other men. And human beings come with flaws and imperfections and contradictions. And this contradiction is at the heart of American history. How do these men who fight for liberty and justice and freedom go home to plantations utterly dependent upon enslaved labor? I write in the introduction to the book, it's a famous line from the Englishman, Dr. Samuel Johnson, how is it we hear the loudest yelps of liberty from the drivers of Negroes? This was a question that was asked in 1775, and we still are talking about it and answering it. It's a hard question, and I think that in this age when we want students to think for themselves, it's a really good idea to give them this information and perhaps let them think for themselves about it. I don't particularly come to any astonishing conclusions in this book. I like to have the idea that people can read for themselves and certainly think for themselves, and that's what school ultimately should be doing.
I heard a phrase just a couple of days ago that I've been thinking about in relation to your book. It's called constant comparative, where we're constantly comparing the new information that we receive to the old information that's in our head. And I think your book is a really good example of that. It's, what's the knowledge that students already have about these famous men? And how do we introduce this new information so that they are using those critical thinking skills that are so important as they move along through school and as citizens? And I was thinking in particular, as I was driving into work this morning, actually about using a word cloud to demonstrate this, and I think word clouds can be really powerful for students. What if you did sort of an opening activity where you had all the students type into a document what they know about Washington? And then you take all of those words and you pop them into a word cloud, because in a word cloud, the words that come up the most are the biggest. And so then you can kind of see and show it to the class. Are the words that come up probably president, probably general, Valley Forge, maybe.
Hero, founder,
exactly.
Founding father. Yeah.
But do the
cherry
words.
Tree.
Cannot tell a lie. But do the words slavery or slave owner even appear? And I think that would be a really good starting point for saying, okay, here's what you know. Now let's bring in new information. And so that's where I think your book is a really great entry into that.
Well, I'm always amazed and astonished that teachers like you are thinking about things like this. And if I have some small piece to add to that, that's wonderful. And that's kind of how I see my job. But for me, it comes back to telling stories. I think historians are at heart, good historians are at heart good storytellers. And good stories don't mean good made-up stories. Good stories mean good stories. And I think that the stories of Washington that children used to learn, and I think we've come a long way from moving away from the Parson Weems depiction of George Washington. I don't know, in elementary school, for instance, how much of Washington's relationship with enslaved people is discussed. But certainly if you go to Mount Vernon and you go to Montpelier and you go to Monticello or the Hermitage, these facts are in the open much more so than they used to be. In fact, Mount Vernon now has a complete display called Lives Bound Together about Washington's relationship with enslaved people. So, I'm not breaking such new ground that this hasn't been out there for a while, and I think that a younger generation of teachers is certainly very aware of it. So I'm hopeful that the conversation has changed a little bit, and so we don't have children who are getting to middle school and still have the cherry tree version. I suspect we're moving away from that a little bit, but the fact is that we still need to tell the whole story, even as we tell the stories of what men like the founding fathers accomplished. And of course, many of the men who were involved in the Declaration of Independence, in fact, more than 40 of the 56 signers, either owned slaves or had something to do with the slave trade. And that is a fact. We are living in a world right now where the idea of facts is being put under a microscope. But these are facts, and I think, as John Adams said, facts are stubborn things. And I think we should just be honest, be appropriate, but be honest and accurate, and tell kids the truth, and that the truth ultimately will set you free.
Well, I think we have a couple of minutes left, Kenneth, and we got some questions on the Facebook page from some participants, so I'm going to feed you a couple.
Okay.
And I'm going to probably butcher these names, so for those of you listening, I apologize in advance. From Janice Schachter, how did you go about choosing the enslaved people to highlight in the book, and were there others that you could have chosen?
Absolutely, there were others I could have chosen. The five in the book are, well, first of all, I focused on the enslaved people who were the property of presidents because, number one, the contradiction is so pronounced in their cases. And the fact is that because they were the property of presidents and lived with them 24/7, there is far more documentation about these people than there would be for the typical field hand at Monticello, for instance. The other thing that's very, very particular to these five people is that in almost every case, we have firsthand accounts that they offered. So we have true primary sources. Oni Judge, the character in one of the characters in the book, told her story to an abolitionist minister late in her life. Isaac Granger Jefferson, told his story later in his life. Paul Jennings actually wrote the first memoir of anyone who'd ever worked in the White House, but he was writing as an enslaved teenager. And Alfred Jackson lived, again, into the 20th century. This is a man who died in 1901. So he also was able to relate a great deal of what he had seen and heard over the years. So I chose these five in part because their stories are compelling, but also because we do have an extraordinary amount of documentation for them. And that's why I chose these five.
there's a question from Dan Krutka that I'm going to tackle because it's about primary sources, and I love primary sources, and I think a lot of kids and teachers do too. And he says, what primary sources do you think can help students better understand the stories in this book? And so I have a couple of suggestions. You talk about the runaway slave advertisements, and you can actually go into Chronicling America, which is the collection of newspapers at the Library of Congress. Those newspapers have now been extended back to 1789, which is amazing. And you can do searches for runaway slave, and that will pull up from the collections runaway slave advertisements. And some of them are short and really digestible for kids. And so I think those are really great, especially when you see things like $5 reward for 23-year-old man. I mean, that's really compelling stuff. I also feel like you could go to the Documenting the American South site, which is excellent, and they have a number of slave narratives from a number of people, including Olade Equiano, who you talk about in the book. And the last place that I would send teachers is the census records. I love census records. I think they're fascinating, and you will find Jefferson, Madison, and Jackson in the census records. And you can see not necessarily the names of the people that were enslaved, but you can see the number of people that each of these men and others owned. And in 1850, they did a special slave census. So those are some places that I would go. Do you have any thoughts on that, Kenneth?
Yeah, and the richness of the sources of material now are extraordinary. One of the, obviously, start with the Library of Congress and their resources in this area of the history of the enslaved is extraordinary. The Schomburg Center, part of the New York Public Library, is also another extraordinary resource where they've really put an amazing amount of documentation online, very easily accessible. I just happened to grab it off my shelf because it's right behind me, but there he is. That is Paul Jennings, and this is it's a pamphlet really, but it is a memoir, A Colored Man's Reminiscences of James Madison by Paul Jennings, published in 1865. So we do have firsthand accounts from some of these people that count as primary sources. The homes are also really rich sources of material. I spent a great deal of time. I mentioned the 4 homes that I've been to most: Mount Vernon, Monticello, Montpelier, all in Virginia, of course, and then the Hermitage in Tennessee, outside of Nashville. So those are some of my go-to sources.
Perfect. Well, this has been so good, Kenneth. It's been so good to chat with you about this, and we get to do this 3 more times.
I can't wait.
I'm excited.
We haven't even gotten to the real juicy parts yet.
I know it. And thank goodness for technology that I can see you in New York and don't have to come out to Minnesota, where it's currently about 20 below zero. So, so next week we will have part 2, where we'll talk about the next section of the book. So until then, we're so glad that people are interested in participating, and we'll see you next week.
And I just want to thank all of my old friends at SSChat for setting this up, Michael and Dan Kurtz and others. This is a great opportunity for me to be able to sit in. This is my office in New York City. I get to sit here and do all this research and write these books, but the ability to come out and talk to people is, of course, an extraordinary one, and I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity. So I look forward to the next installment. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenneth.
Bye.
Bye.